You can support In the Past Lane by buying some of our merchandise, like shirts, hoodies, mugs, and stickers. Just go to our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. In 1837, newspaper publisher Elijah P. Lovejoy moved his family from St. Louis, Missouri to Alton, Illinois. The move was made necessary by acts of vandalism against his newspaper and threats of physical violence by supporters of slavery who denounced Lovejoy for his anti-slavery editorials. But Lovejoy found no safety in Alton. As soon as his printing press arrived by steamboat, an anti-abolitionist mob formed with the intent of destroying it. And when Lovejoy tried to stop them, a member of the mob shot him dead. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 140, in which we explore how the United States became an anti-slavery nation. We are brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and come to you this week from the KansasNebraska studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Keeping us between the lines is our benevolent taskmaster, executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Hey Lulu, how's everything going there in the booth?
Ask any more questions, I'm pulling the fire alarm.
Guess I'll check in a little bit later. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, it's a pretty exhausting time, as this is the last week of classes at the college. Everyone seems a little run down, but also boosted by the onset of spring weather and late sunsets, and the distinctive smell of mulch. Holy Cross College, where I work, takes great pride in the beauty of its campus, and its award-winning groundskeeping crew uses a lot of mulch. I mean, lots of mulch. And you know who else is enjoying spring? Our new puppy Luna. That little cockapoo continues to be a great source of joy. And if you want to see what she looks like, just follow me on Twitter or Instagram. In other news, I just learned that history has experienced a surge in majors at the college, and that now makes us the 5th largest major. Already 47 freshmen have declared history, which suggests that by the end of next year, we might have more than 70 in that one class alone. Compare that to the 42 majors who will graduate in a few weeks. And this is great news, because if you look around the country, history majors, along with all humanities majors, are in steep decline. So this historian at large, who also happens to be chair of the history department, is pretty psyched about it. We've done a lot of work over the past few years to actively recruit majors, and it seems to be working. All right, enough self-congratulation. Time to get to this week's main feature, my interview with historian Graham Peck about his book, Making an Anti-Slavery Nation: Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle Over Freedom. But before we do, I hope you'll consider becoming a patron of the pod for as little as $1 a month. Every little bit helps cover the costs of keeping this thing going. Just head over to inthepastlane.com and click on support. Thanks. Okay, people, let's roll down the windows and enjoy the breeze. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Okay, back at In the Past Lane. I'm Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and with me now is historian Graham Peck. He's a professor of history at St. Xavier University in Chicago, and his research and writing focus on the U.S. in the antebellum period. His work has appeared in scholarly journals such as the Journal of Illinois History and the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. His first book, which he's here to talk about, is titled Making an Anti-Slavery Nation: Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle Over Freedom. In the course of our discussion, Graham explains how political struggles between anti-slavery and pro-slavery settlers in Illinois in the 1820s provided a preview of the national debates over slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. How and why anti-slavery leaders in the years before the Civil War were content to leave slavery alone where it existed, but were adamantly opposed to allowing its extension into the American West. why the controversy generated by the KansasNebraska Act of 1854 proved to be a key tipping point in the mobilization and unification of political anti-slavery into what became the Republican Party. And a quick refresher here, the KansasNebraska Act of 1854 allowed for the organization of two territories, Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. But it was intensely controversial because it repealed the restrictions on slavery contained in the Missouri Compromise, thereby opening up the possibility that slavery could spread to the territories in the North and West. Graham also explains how Abraham Lincoln emerged at this time, becoming a leading advocate of what Peck calls anti-slavery nationalism, that argued that the U.S. had been founded upon the principles of universal freedom with an eye towards the eventual eradication of slavery, and that this position was actually conservative, and that it was pro-slavery activists who wanted to expand slavery who were the actual radicals who threatened the nation's well-being. Graham Peck, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thanks for inviting me, Ed.
Well, you're welcome. I want to start off by asking you to explain to our listeners why you framed the book the way you did. That's to say, most books that examine the political crisis over slavery that leads to the Civil War, they start with the end of the Mexican War, 1848, and really focus on the 1850s as sort of the crucial period. But you've elected to take a much broader view by starting your study in the period of the founding in the late 18th century, and then diving deeply into the history and politics of slavery in the early 19th century, on up to the 1850s. So why is it important to see the fight over slavery as a 70-year struggle, leading up to 1861 and the start of the Civil War?
I think the answer is that slavery was embedded in the American Constitution and American society and economics from the inception of the country, in fact, even prior to the Constitution. But the Constitution set the political framework up that Americans following that would have to utilize in order to address the problem. And it seemed to me that to simply analyze the slavery issue as a problem of expansion, which is really the central issue that presents itself by the mid-1840s, was too limited a framework because Northerners and Southerners had already been dealing with the problem of slavery in America for a much longer period of time.
Yeah, so it's something that's present at the very beginning, and as you say, even before the founding period, Americans on some level are debating the presence and the wisdom of having slavery in a nation, especially in the founding period, in a nation that begins to define itself as a nation of liberty. So that, I think, does provide a really interesting insight into the depth of this debate over slavery, that it is something that connects to the very founding of the country. And another important way in which you frame your book is to focus intently on Illinois as sort of a window into the larger struggle over this question. And so what is it about Illinois that makes it, in some ways, an ideal place for your book?
Well, the interesting thing about Illinois is it's settled initially by Southerners coming down the Ohio River. And naturally, they bring their slaves with them. And so they set up structures of authority that allow those slaves to be indentured servants legally, which theoretically shouldn't have been possible because under the Northwest Ordinance, the territories north of the Ohio River were supposed to be forever free of slavery. But this was a legal mechanism they used to enable them to bring their property and to keep their property in Illinois. And so as the decades passed and a predominantly anti-slavery population did migrate into the state, there was a real tension over how to deal with the slavery issue because there were de facto slaves living in Illinois. And this led to conflict both over the 1818 Constitution and later, which was essentially a constitution that banned future slavery but permitted the existing slavery. That was the compromise position that was created, very much like the national constitution was a compromise in the late 1780s. And yet even that compromise position was not a position that settled the issue because by the early 1820s, with Illinoisans no longer needing to worry about oversight from Congress, Southerners who had slaves initiated a pro-slavery movement in Illinois attempting to change the Constitution to make slavery legal. And this set off a huge conflict between the anti-slavery folks who'd migrated into the state and those individuals who were thinking that maybe slavery would be the best way to benefit them economically if it was legalized. And the debate was fierce and ran for well over a year. And ultimately, only the immigration of additional anti-slavery folks near the end of that debate in 1824 carried the vote for the anti-slavery side. So Illinois comes into the Union anti-slavery and remains so, but barely, because they actually had a debate over whether to become a slave state. And in a sense, therefore, Illinois represents the tensions over slavery very aptly in the nation at large. So I call it sort of a case of the nation in miniature.
Right, in miniature and also in an earlier version, when we think of the typical study or the classic clash that emerges in the 1840s and 1850s, it's actually happening in the 1820s in Illinois.
That's exactly right. And of course, it wasn't just Illinois, but Illinois is a nice place where you have one polity with a constitution where you can examine how these issues get negotiated. And that would continue in the subsequent decades. So abolitionists who really start arriving in the state in larger numbers in the 1830s start getting disgruntled with the condition of the nation and of the state. And an attempt to create a state anti-slavery society in 1837 results in one of the most notable episodes of mob violence in American history, where Elijah P. Lovejoy, the lead organizer of the event, is murdered in Alton, Illinois, by anti-abolitionists. They weren't necessarily pro-slavery, but they were determined to stamp out an anti-slavery movement that they believe threatened the nation. And they thought that it was their duty as Americans to quash this kind of illegal and unconstitutional behavior because Southerners would leave the Union if they deemed that Northerners were unwilling to accept a nation that had slavery. And so Illinois, again, you see these tensions in the state between these very sharply opposed groups. And that kind of opposition was partly due to the early settlement of Southerners in the state and partly due to the economic connections that Illinois had as a border state, especially in a place like Alton, where they're very close to St. Louis. There's a lot of economic ties and there are a lot of cultural ties. And Illinois' position geographically, likewise, will bring up the issue of the transit of slaves across the state, which becomes an issue in the 1840s particularly. Slaveholders were used to traveling through Illinois with their slaves, which was legal insofar as the state legislature permitted it. But over time, anti-slavery folks decide to challenge that, and they argue, following anti-slavery legal doctrine throughout the North, that slavery couldn't exist in a free state, and if a slaveholder voluntarily brought a slave into the state, the slave was freed automatically as soon as the slave stepped into a free state. And ultimately, Illinois' courts, the last in the North to do so, but they ultimately endorsed this decision because the alternative seemed impossible, that they would actually say property in man is something that can exist outside of a specific sovereignty that has violated natural law and has decided to create a positive law that strips people of their natural rights. And the Illinois courts were not willing to do that despite the sympathies for the South in the North. So you see these escalating tensions, and those tensions will ultimately culminate in the epic battle between Stephen A. Douglas and Abraham Lincoln in the 1850s.
Right. And before we get there, let's widen the lens a little bit here, because you mentioned Lovejoy and the abolitionists. They are calling, we should define our terms here a little bit, the difference between abolition and anti-slavery. There's actually quite a big difference between the two, in the sense that anti-slavery people are against, they think slavery is a bad thing, but they're not quite prepared to say that it should be abolished outright or by, congressional act. They have ideas about it maybe being phased out or contained in the South where it dies a natural economic death. And then there were abolitionists like Lovejoy and then perhaps more famously William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator, and also Frederick Douglass, who call for the immediate, complete, uncompensated abolition of slavery. So there's sort of two kinds of ways of opposing slavery. And then another thing that emerges that they sort of go in, hand in hand, is a very vigorous pro-slavery ideology that starts to emerge in the 1830s. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about both these things as they kind of heat up the political and rhetoric and are in many ways intimately tied to the economy of the nation.
Yeah, and maybe we can go back again to the founding period because that's when the problem presents itself initially. I think that most of the founders were in theory anti-slavery, not all, but they were trying to make a union. That was the central challenge in the 1780s. And the price of union was to accept disparate kinds of relations to property in the various states. So it was very difficult at that time for Northerners to mount an anti-slavery challenge to the South because the Southerners likely would not have joined the Union, or at least it would have been a dangerous gamble to take in the Constitutional Convention. And that same problem is the most important complicating factor throughout the next 70 years, because Northerners are in a union that they feel a huge stake in. They believe it's the arc of liberty for not only their country, but prospectively the world. And they're very unwilling to destroy that by going back on the bargain. And many of them feel, indeed, that was the bargain at the founding era. So that helps us understand what's going to transpire as time moves forward. And there are two significant changes that I think emerge. One of them is the emergence, as you suggest, of a powerful pro-slavery argument that really wasn't articulated in the 1780s in anywhere near the same way. Right. And correspondingly, a very sharp anti-slavery argument that also was not articulated in so pronounced a way in an earlier era. And the anti-slavery Northerners who mentioned that were not abolitionists are caught in the middle of these two positions. So perhaps I'll address each of those in turn. You know, it's very interesting when I was reading the archives of a Democratic congressman named Adam Snyder. He reports back in a letter that I don't even mention this in my book, but he writes a letter that I read, and he says, speaking of 1837, that John C. Calhoun just gave a speech in which he called slavery a positive good, right. And he is shocked, and he says the entire Senate has been shocked by this. No one can believe that this doctrine has been articulated because it had been widely accepted for a very long time that slavery was an evil, a necessary evil, perhaps because no one knew how to get rid of it, and it was the second largest property interest in the nation behind land. But it wasn't good, and no one was proud of it for the most part.
Right, and we're sort of stuck with it. That's one of the way they often said it's an inheritance from our forefathers, and we're stuck with it and in some ways want to get rid of slavery, but we can't, so leave it alone.
Precisely. And so Snyder, who is a Democrat and in fact very sympathetic to the slaveholders, has all of these cultural ties to the South, he is nevertheless horrified by this, and yet the pro-slavery position is going to harden. Calhoun's position within 10 years is going to become Southern orthodoxy, and therefore the Northern advocates of union like Snyder are going to have to deal with that new political reality. How then do they defend union, and how do they defend the Democratic Party, which because of Southern influence tended to be very pro-slavery? How do they defend that party and the union in the North under these new circumstances? And that job was made much more difficult by the emergence of people like Garrison and Lovejoy, who start claiming that the nation should be free entirely, and that there needs to be decisive action taken precisely because the hope of the founding generation that slavery would simply disappear due to political economy, that slaveholders would ultimately free their slaves because it would become more profitable for them to pay them as free laborers, that dream has vanished. And in its place is an expanding empire of slavery that has expanded into the Southwest, and the slaveholders are demanding more and more territory. They've got their eyes set on Cuba, on Central America, on stretching out to California. They want that land because they're making an enormous amount of money through the cotton economy. And by 1860, the Southerners are producing 75% of the world's cotton, and that cotton is driving the Industrial Revolution. And so slavery is at the heart of the economic empire, not only the South, but really of the nation. It's the great export of the entire country by 1860. So abolitionists in the 1830s perceive this. That development has been already ongoing for decades. They understand slavery is not going anywhere, and they say we must take action against it. So while they are pushing this political agenda and ultimately create a political party known as the Liberty Party in 1840 in order to try and rouse the North to begin promoting national policies that will promote freedom and try and pen slavery into the South without permitting its expansion, that doctrine is leading to massive national conflict because the pro-slavery Southerners are totally intolerant of it. And both Democrats and Whigs in the North are caught in the middle. And so both of them are ambivalent. Democrats are ambivalent because even though they tend to be more sympathetic to slavery, they nevertheless generally assume that all people should be free. There are some exceptions to that, but that's a general position they take. And they're willing, however, more willing than Whigs, to say blacks are inferior, and we certainly don't want to disrupt the Union on behalf of black slaves. So they're unwilling to push that issue for the most part, yet they're also ambivalent about Southern pro-slavery politics. And Whigs, for their part, are also very protective of the Union. They tend to be more anti-slavery whenever slavery penetrates politics. It's harder to get Northern Whig congressmen to vote for pro-slavery measures, whereas you'll always get a good chunk of the Democrats, about half of them, will vote for pro-slavery measures when pushed. Right. Whigs won't do that for the most part, but they still don't want a civil war. They don't want secession. They don't want the disruption of the fabric of the Union, which they think is absolutely essential to ordered liberty. And they are afraid, the danger of liberty, the American founders had been afraid of this, that liberty can degenerate into license and into anarchy, into chaos. And that's no panacea to any kind of problem. So to live in a world of ordered liberty is probably to accept some imperfections in society. So that's the tension between these various groupings broadly conceived.
Right, and it seems like there's a big middle where a lot of people seem to agree that the best solution for this contentious issue of slavery is to find a way to shove it into the corner, to actually not talk about it and to avoid engaging with it because it is so controversial and it does seem to be so disruptive. And for episodically that seems to work, and then an incident arises, and then, of course, there's the Mexican War in the late 1840s that restokes the issue. And there's the Compromise of 1850 that comes out of the Mexican War, and the controversies of one part of that are very intense, the Fugitive Slave Act. But you argue that among all of these major upticks in tension over the question of slavery, that the KansasNebraska Act of 1854 seems to be what in our modern times we'd call a tipping point. So what is the KansasNebraska Act? It's sort of in miniature, but then what makes it such a crucial pivot point or tipping point in this story of contest over the place of slavery in the nation of liberty?
The KansasNebraska Act in 1854 was the product of Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas's desire to expand the country fully to California by organizing all of the territory that lay in between the Mississippi River and California, which had been admitted into the Union as a free state in 1850. Before organizing the lands that had been acquired in 1803 in the Louisiana Purchase, and some of those lands were still filled with Native American tribes, those tribes had to be moved off the land, and the land had to be organized so it could be sold by the federal government. And after that point, a railroad could be run through those lands all the way to California. Right. So this was the dream of the proponents of Manifest Destiny, of which Douglas was one of the preeminent advocates. And in his position as a leading American senator by 1854, made nationally famous by his role in 1850 in adjudicating the issues over the expansion of the country through the acquisition of Mexican territories in the war with Mexico in the 1840s, Douglas was in a position to drive through a law that would permit the organization of those territories. And it was a difficult thing to achieve because Southern senators were unwilling to organize additional free states, and they were quite convinced that all of the territories that Douglas was going to organize, and initially called Nebraska Territory, but the legislation that was produced ultimately divided the lands into Kansas and Nebraska territories, hence the KansasNebraska Act. And those territories were going to produce free states because they had initially been because in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, the Congress of the time had agreed to put a slavery prohibition on all those lands above the 3630 line. And so now the North was ready to organize those territories for settlers to move in, but Southerners didn't want to admit in additional free states, and so they blocked Douglas's attempts to organize these territories, and in fact had blocked them for years. So by 1854, Douglas is determined to organize the territories, and he agrees to apply a relatively new concept, that called popular sovereignty, to these territories. And the basis of popular sovereignty was the idea that the people in the territories should decide whether or not those territories would write a pro-slavery or anti-slavery state constitution before coming into the Union. Douglas argues that this is a very democratic procedure and approach to the problem of slavery's expansion. Let the people decide. And this probably would have been unobjectionable to most Americans had the Missouri Compromise prohibition not been already in effect.
That's right, because it already seems like it was, Douglas is saying this is democratic, but his opponents are saying, well, no, it's overturning settled law in the form of the Missouri Compromise prohibition of slavery.
Yes, precisely, and it was deeply objectionable because the Southerners had already gotten their half of the loaf from the Missouri Compromise. Missouri had been admitted as a free state, and they had eaten down that half of the loaf. And now, to many Northerners, the Southerners are now grabbing their half of the loaf, all these unorganized territories that remained from Louisiana Purchase, and they were shoving them in their mouth and eating them with the help of Stephen A. Douglas. So this was a terrible blow to that broad middle that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the anti-slavery constituency that was not abolitionist, that did not want disunion, that did not want national disruption, and yet very much believed that a deal had been done, the North had made a compromise earlier, and now these free lands have been dedicated to freedom as they should have been under the National Compact because they believed the nation at its core was anti-slavery. The doctrines of the nation fundamentally were against the enslavement of human beings. They didn't see why that land should now be given the opportunity on the vote of a small number of settlers to become slave territory. And so there was a set of things going on all at once. One, their convictions this was a broken bargain. Second, the nation had been consecrated to freedom, and that ideal was now threatened. Thirdly, some Northerners wanted to go to those territories, so this was an immediate economic threat to them because slaveholders theoretically would drive them out of the best land because the slaveholders would be wealthy and they'd bring slave labor, and white free laborers in the North didn't want to compete with those slave laborers. And then fourthly, an additional complication was that if these states came in as slave states, the Southerners would have yet more political power, and that seemed like a very bad idea since the country had just been going through a series of conflicts over slavery in the past, 3.5 decades. So for all of those reasons, Northerners are absolutely outraged. As Douglas later says, he could find his way from Washington to Chicago by the light of his burning effigies that were hung up on trees along the railroad lines.
Yes.
So there's a great deal of rage in the North, and among the people who will rise up to oppose this bill is Abraham Lincoln.
That's right. So tell us more about Lincoln. He's already a politician. He's well known in Illinois, has served in Congress, but 1854 is really where the Lincoln that we know and the Lincoln that will become a national figure emerges. And he sees it as, a moment in history, a moment in national history that he can't refuse because he sees that the fate of the nation, the character of the nation is at stake. And he begins to articulate not something he invented, but he sort of pulls together the strands of what you call anti-slavery nationalism. So tell us, what is anti-slavery nationalism and how Lincoln becomes this great articulator of it as a way to kind of keep the nation in the direction that he believes it should be going?
Well, fundamentally, anti-slavery nationalism is a type of nationalism that links anti-slavery to the national project and claims that the nation was founded on the ideal of freedom and needs to carry out that ideal for, among other reasons, the propagation of this ideal throughout the world, that it's a better way of organizing human society. So this concept of America as the ark of human liberty is very much bound up in the anti-slavery nationalism that Lincoln and others propound by the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be said that this idea very much has origins in abolitionist thought, as I think the Republican Party generally absorbs a number of key abolitionist ideas. So Lincoln is essentially talking to that great middle that you mentioned before. He takes some critical concepts from the abolitionists and he fashions them in a way that appears conservative to the average Northern voter. Because until the 1850s, until 1854, typically most Northern voters looked at abolitionists and said they are disorganizers.
Right.
They are radicals and fanatics.
And dangerous.
They have this idea of black equality that most of us think doesn't make any sense at all. And they're willing to rend the nation to push this idea onto the southern states that don't want it. And we don't know what the consequences of that idea would be anyway. Is it really a good thing if black people were freed? Will that result in the good, beneficial outcomes that they claim? So that kind of disorganizing attitude towards what was considered radicalism was a big inhibition on anti-slavery politics, right? The idea that you'll translate anti-slavery sentiment, which you may feel, into votes at the ballot box that will try and organize a government that will oppose slavery. That was always the challenge for the anti-slavery side. When Lincoln steps in, he steps in at a moment where that is it's more possible to fashion that anti-slavery political organization than it had ever been in American history, because the North is in an outrage over what is perceived as a gross pro-slavery imposition on freedom, that slavery was clearly on the attack. So whereas abolitionists previously had been perceived as the aggressor by Northerners, now Southerners and slave owners are perceived as the aggressor, and Northerners need to defend their own society, their own freedoms, and the country's position in sort of the history of the world. All of that is at stake, says Lincoln in his speeches in 1854. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we might not know of his speeches if he had never been elected to the presidency, but now we read his great Peoria address, which he gave in a multitude of locations as he traipsed around following Douglas, trying to kind of harass him on the campaign trail in late 1854. But he gives this extraordinary speech, which he knew was good, and we have it because he published it in the newspaper. So he wrote it all out, submitted it to his political organ, and published it there, this 3-hour-long speech. And he has many, many arguments, far too many to cover here. But I think at the core of it is this concept that we must return to the nation's founding ideals. That he says at one point, the doctrines of Douglas, had they been enunciated at the Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia, the doorkeeper would have throttled the man who said them and shoved him back into the street, wouldn't have permitted him entry.
Right.
And so this is sort of the appeal to an imagined national past, because I think all of the political actors in the 1850s, as political actors do now, try to make the most of the past to buttress their current political position.
That's right.
And so Lincoln's position didn't fully account for the fact that the founders propounded freedom in the Northwest Territories and barred slavery from going there. They did not bar slavery from going to the Southwest, and in fact, slavery did spread there. And so I think that there was always a more complex national legacy because slavery was woven into the country's economy, society, and politics from the beginning. But Lincoln takes this complex story and he says the core idea, though, was freedom, and the expectation was slavery would die. Since slavery's not dying and now slavery's being aggressive and attempting to potentially destroy freedom, we must defend it, and that requires political organization. So that's where Lincoln kind of leaps into national politics in 1854.
Along with the emergence of the political party that he'll ride to national fame, which is the Republican Party, comes right out of that controversy itself. So the two, both the man and the vehicle, arrive at the same time, and there's some sorting out that has to take place in terms of what the party stands for. But it does come to embrace that anti-slavery nationalism as well. And as you point out, good politics is about taking complex, muddy things and making them really simple and straightforward. So Lincoln is really great at that, in articulating that the true radicals are the pro-slavery people, the Douglas people, and that the true conservators of the legacy of 1776 are the Republicans and those who seek to bottle slavery up and keep it where it is so that it will die this natural death. So what's important in the coming years after that? Obviously, we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but what happens nationally and also between these two rival figures from Illinois?
Well, I think the key thing that you mentioned, first of all, that deserves discussion is how the Republican Party comes together. Because the only way that this anti-slavery vision could be realized is if the Republican Party managed to control the North. And to do that, they had to get over 50% of the voters in most of the northern states, because they certainly weren't going to succeed in the southern states. It was going to be very difficult just to get on the ballot as a Republican in any southern state. And that was a complex problem because the various anti-slavery elements were not necessarily on good terms. So there were anti-slavery Whigs who didn't necessarily love anti-slavery Democrats, whom they'd been battling with on other issues for 20 years. There were anti-slavery abolitionists, obviously, and no one had really been on great terms with them for the most part, considering them radicals. And then there were anti-slavery Germans as part of the Great German Migration in the 1840s and 1850s into the United States and certainly into Illinois. And the anti-slavery Germans didn't tend to like very much the anti-slavery nativists, who also emerged with the arrival of the Germans. And just like today there's a nativist movement in response to immigration, so too in the 1840s and 1850s. And so there was a huge nativist movement known as the Know Nothing movement that actually emerges as a serious competitor to the Republicans in 1854, because the northern parties are so disorganized that both the Republicans and this nativist movement emerge in force. And it's not until 1856 that the Republicans Republican Party essentially gains control of most of Northern politics, puts down this know-nothing rival, and collects a lot of the know-nothing votes into its organization. But that required getting the anti-slavery nativists to play nicely in the sandbox with the anti-slavery Germans, and you can imagine that was not a marriage made in heaven. There was some tensions over that combination. So all of those groups, the 5 groups I mentioned, had to find a way of creating a politics that made sense to all of them, because if any one of those groups dropped out, the Douglas Democrats, throughout the North were powerful enough to maintain a hold on Northern politics. And ultimately, I think that's where the anti-slavery nationalism makes sense, because all of them perceive this as sufficiently conservative that they're willing to join on board. And there's a number of conservative groups in those ones that I mentioned. In fact, I think it's most of those groups are very, very shy of a national trauma. And Douglas, of course, over the next 6 years, along with many Northern Democrats, says this precisely to the Northern public. He says, vote for the Republicans and go ahead and watch the bloodshed unfold. The Southerners won't stand for this. They're going to leave, and it will be very, very ugly. And the Republicans respond by saying, no, it'll be fine.
Right.
They will accept this. They're full of bluster. We're not being unreasonable. We're conservative. We're reflecting the nation's vision, and we're not going to take away their slaves. We're not threatening their property rights. We're simply going to prevent them from expanding into the nation's territories. And that really is kind of the core policy that will be in accord with the nationalist ideal. And that policy will say, if we pin the slaves in the existing southern states, slavery will eventually die. That probably wasn't true, but most Americans, including Southerners, believed it at the time,
right.
And those beliefs had profound consequences.
And in some ways, this mix of groups, competing groups, factions that come to form the Republican Party, in some ways they're aided by events. And, it's 1 year after 1856 that the Supreme Court issues its Dred Scott ruling, which furthers this notion that you mentioned of not just, slavery as being a bad thing, but slavery as a political entity, being aggressive and being, what they called the slave power, capital S, capital P, aggressively trying to radically change the nation and thwart the spirit of 1776. Is that part of the way in which the Republican Party comes to coalesce and become almost out of nowhere a viable national party?
Absolutely. And the Dred Scott decision is very important to the Republican Party because the Dred Scott decision was essentially an attempt by Southern jurists to destroy the Republican Party. Because one of the things that came out of that decision was a ruling that it was not constitutional for Congress to forbid slavery, to preclude slavery in national territories, which was precisely the central Republican doctrine that had been articulated in 1856. Mm-hmm. So essentially it was an attempt to judicially wipe out the basis for a huge political movement, and reminds us, of course, that it's very hard for judges to do that in this country, because Lincoln's response to that as a leader in Illinois was, we're going to keep moving forward, and ultimately we will pass laws that will challenge the Supreme Court on this issue. And as president, ultimately, if we can take the presidency, then you put in Supreme Court justices that have a different opinion. So the same kind of battles we're facing today were similarly embedded in national politics in the 1950s. It was a huge struggle for power, and the Dred Scott decision emblematized the degree to which Southern political power was resting on their control of national politics, because all of those Southern jurists, and the Supreme Court was dominated by Southern jurists, they had been put on predominantly by Democratic Party presidents. So there really was in Lincoln's mind a fight for the future of the country, and the Dred Scott decision and things like Bleeding Kansas, which had occurred earlier, where the settlers who traveled into the territory of Kansas after passage of the KansasNebraska Act ended up literally in guerrilla warfare, because the anti-slavery and pro-slavery settlers were both intending to take charge of that territory and vote in either freedom or slavery, respectively. That same kind of conflict, which was before the elections in 1856, definitely helped the Republicans rise to power, because there were newspaper reports that come in from Kansas that talk about the depredations on these innocent free soil settlers who'd gone there to settle what should have been free territories, and now they're being assaulted by pro-slavery guerrilla marauders. And this sort of development was deeply alarming to the great middle, to the portion of the American population that didn't know quite what to do about slavery, but now seeing that slavery was attacking freedom, were much more willing to align with a political movement to protect the interests of freedom.
And ultimately, as you point out, the only way this thing ultimately gets settled is that war, that conflict that many Democrats had been predicting. Lincoln is elected in 1860. He defeats his great rival, Stephen A. Douglas, and a couple of other candidates. And his mere election is cause for triggering of secession. It's kind of coincidental, but we are speaking on December 20th, 2018, and that's, of course, the anniversary of South Carolina becoming the first state to declare that it's leaving the Union. And ultimately, nobody knows this, but ultimately the war to preserve that Union also becomes the war to destroy slavery. So things that people could only imagine and predict ultimately do, in fact, happen over the course of the war. Well, in terms of wrapping up this fascinating conversation, and you've already touched on it a little bit, the question I always ask the people that I interview each time is, the book that you've written is quite compelling. It's really a critical chapter in American history. But is there something in this story of the 7 decades before the Civil War and the great debate over this issue of slavery, is there something in this that speaks to us now in the 21st century, in 2018, 2019, that's important? You know, what's important about the story that you chronicle in Making an Anti-Slavery Nation?
Well, I think there's many possible applications for any historical interpretation. I guess I would focus on 3 interrelated issues that flow from my interest in the origins of the Civil War, which is really the way that I frame the book as a whole. I think the first is that just as the abolitionists perceived a problem in their society and sought to fix it, and had to, in that process, convince other Northerners to support their project, which was the project of emancipation, I think it's a really good thing for Americans today to think about how we can improve our society, to take a positive outlook to realizing that we have an opportunity and really an obligation to shape our society moving forward in a positive way, to contribute to a better world in some fashion. So I think that that's one aspect of the story in my book. The second application, however, is partly at odds with this first application, because it's also the case that people have conflicting ideas about how to improve the world, and that was also true prior to the Civil War.
Much.
So it wasn't just abolitionists who thought that they were imagining a better future. The proponents of Manifest Destiny thought that. John C. Calhoun and the proponents of the proslavery argument thought this, and yet those 3 different perspectives alone were not compatible. It was not possible to expand the nation and to be anti-slavery and to be pro-slavery. And so the concerted efforts of 3 different groups trying to make improvements created conflict. And that, I think, is a fundamental element of human society and certainly of our national history and of our national future. And so I think that even when we as a people or as individuals are seeking to make change, we have to recognize that conflict and uncertainty are going to flow from that, and which is just what you mentioned when you were talking about the unexpected results of the Civil War. And that brings me, I think, to the third application, which is that we need to have a due regard for humility and toleration as we sort out what the future holds, because none of us really can know that. And I think Lincoln's second inaugural is a great example of that, where here's a man who's profoundly proud of emancipation. He thinks it cements his legacy, and he says, people will remember me now, for sure. And he also recognizes his role in helping bring the Republican Party into power. So it's not, I think, that he would throw that fish back, but it's also the case there's been this extraordinary war that has laid low the country, and he's humbled by that destruction, because that he had not encompassed that in his vision, in his pre-war vision, he had not encompassed that possibility, even though other people had, like Douglas, and said that's going to happen. So I think that reminds us that, as I often tell students, that people in the past can't know the future, and it's incumbent upon us to have a kind of toleration and willingness to work with people who disagree with us, which is right now, I think, a pressing challenge that we face, because we've got big problems too, whether it's global warming, threat of nuclear proliferation, whether there's going to be fresh water in the future for people, the whole issue of immigration throughout the world. All of these are very difficult issues. They're not easy to resolve. There's a lot of people in the great middle now on these issues, just like there were then. And yet we have to try and forge policies to improve the circumstances of people who live now, and we have to do that in a sense in a country as a polity, because we live in a sovereignty just like the people in the mid-19th century United States did. It had to be faced as a country because the country makes laws. So I look at all that as kind of very important ways to think about problems we face now. And I point out to students that the interesting thing about the Civil War is probably the best solution would have been gradual and compensated emancipation, where the North agreed as part of a national problem to pay to get rid of a national sin, so to speak.
Right.
But the interesting thing is neither Northerners or Southerners were really willing to consider that for a moment. They both said it was impossible. Northerners, because you couldn't pay this much money, slavery was the second biggest property interest. It was impossible to do that. And Southerners, because even if it was possible, did not believe they could live in a biracial society, much less a biracial democracy. And yet, what has happened? Both of those things happened. The Civil War cost more than simply paying for the slaves, and we are living in a biracial democracy. So those people went through a monumental Civil War that's cast a long shadow in American history and leaves us bitterness to this very day. Mm-hmm. And because of their failure to imagine what we can see was possible, but they couldn't. And so I think I always try and get students to understand how we should stand in humility when we think about the past, because we do need to move forward with some optimism and attempt to make improvements, but recognizing that we don't make history alone. A lot of it's made outside of our control. And so we have to do that with a sense of toleration and desire to build community with other people around us.
Right. I think that's really well stated. And it matches up with some of the ways that I talk about history and talk with my students about history, is that we need to be humble, as you say, when we see how people struggle not knowing what's happening next. I mean, we know what happens next, but that's why we have history books. But they don't have that luxury. And the other is that there's a duty that goes along with this. So you need to be humble, but you also we need to recognize in every era that everything we have ever had and everything we will have is the product of struggle and work.
Yes.
And you even have that embedded in the title of your book, Making an Anti-Slavery Nation. It's not
right. That's correct.
Preserving an anti-slavery nation or having an anti-slavery nation. It had to be made in order for it to become so. It had to go from a vision to reality. And even then, as the story of Reconstruction tells us, it's not over. It's just beginning. A whole new set of challenges emerges as they continue to emerge now. So history has that sort of broad way of helping us see that the struggles in front of us now are similar to, in magnitude, to struggles that were taking place in the past, and that we need to be humble, but we also need to realize that it takes a nation rolling up its sleeves and getting to work on it. So
I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly.
All right. Well, Graham Peck, this has been a terrific conversation, and I really enjoyed reading your book and getting a chance to talk to you about it. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate being on the show.
Graham Peck is the author of Making an Anti-Slavery Nation, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle Over Freedom, published by the University of Illinois Press and available everywhere. Okay, Past Laners, as always, this has been a lot of fun. But alas, we are out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And please leave a starred review. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. Thanks. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the past lane. Hey, Lulu, what's the secret to your happiness?
Lowering my expectations.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.